They survived the Atlantic. They didn't survive the Anchorage. Roger and Margaret Pratt had done the hard part. For 23 days, their yacht Magnetic Attraction had carried them across the Atlantic, through open water, long nights, careful rationing, and the kind of silence only sailors understand. Then, finally, land appeared. Martinique rose on the horizon, and for Roger and Margaret, it felt like the beginning of everything they had worked for. They dropped anchor, opened champagne, and looked ahead to a retirement of warm islands, clear water, and freedom. But just a few weeks later, that same dream would end in the dark waters of St. Lucia. Not during a storm. Not in the middle of the ocean. Not because their boat failed. But while they were moored off View Fort, in what should have been a peaceful Caribbean anchorage. That night, Margaret updated their sailing blog. Roger emailed friends. They had supper on board, turned off the lights, and went to bed around 10:30. Then came a noise from the stern. Footsteps above them. Someone was on the boat. Roger climbed up and shouted for them to go away. But four masked men had already boarded Magnetic Attraction. They had rowed out in a stolen fishing boat, looking for money. Within moments, the quiet retirement yacht became a place of panic, shouting, and violence. Margaret was attacked. Roger fought back. Then the men suddenly fled, jumping into the water and swimming toward shore. When the chaos stopped, Margaret called for Roger. But he was gone. She dropped the dinghy. She called Mayday. Other boats and authorities rushed in. Then, over the radio, came the words that ended the dream. A man had been found floating, face down. This is the story of a couple who crossed an ocean for paradise, and found a nightmare waiting at anchor. Before Magnetic Attraction became the name attached to a murder case, it was the name of a dream Roger and Margaret Pratt had spent decades building. They were not people who had suddenly decided to buy a boat and sail into the Caribbean with no idea what they were doing. Sailing had been part of their lives for years. It was something they had built around weekends, holidays, planning, saving, and slowly working their way toward a much bigger journey. Margaret once summed Roger up in a very simple way. Work was what he did when he was not sailing. Roger had been an engineer at Jaguar Land Rover, which makes sense when you look at the way he chose their boat. He did not want something flashy just because it looked good in a marina. He wanted something strong. Something practical. Something that could take punishment. Magnetic Attraction was a modest 44-foot yacht, but to Roger and Margaret, it was their home from home. Roger wanted a steel hull, the kind of hull that could survive a glancing hit from floating debris or containers out at sea. In many ways, the boat matched its owners. Solid, unfussy, practical, and dependable. That is what makes the story so painful. This was not a reckless fantasy. It was a careful retirement plan. For years, Roger and Margaret had sailed together, building up the confidence and experience they would need to finally cross the Atlantic. For most people, that kind of journey remains something they watch online or read about in sailing magazines. For Roger and Margaret, it became real. They set out across the open water, and for 23 days, there was nothing easy about it. Long-distance sailing is not just blue skies and smooth water. It is rationing supplies, checking systems, watching the weather, trusting the boat, and trusting the person beside you. Every day becomes a routine of small decisions. Every night watch feels longer than the one before. And when you are that far from land, the boat is not just transport. It is the only world you have. Then, after 23 days at sea, the hills of Martinique appeared on the horizon. The crossing was over. Roger and Margaret had made it. They arrived at a safe anchorage around 9 o'clock at night, dropped anchor, and opened a bottle of champagne they had saved specifically for that moment. It should have been the beginning of the best part of their lives: retirement, sailing, adventure, and companionship. And for a little while, that is exactly what it looked like. After Martinique, they sailed to St. Lucia. There, they celebrated Margaret's 60th birthday, dived on reefs, and made friends with other sailors. It was the kind of Caribbean chapter people imagine when they are still stuck in ordinary life, counting down the years until they can finally do something different. Warm water. A boat at anchor. New people. New islands. The quiet feeling that the hard part was behind them. Their life on board probably had the same simple rhythm most cruisers know well. Wake up with the light. Check the boat. Check the weather. Make coffee. Talk about the plan for the day. Maybe go ashore. Maybe swim. Maybe write a blog post or send a few emails home. Then, when night came, return to the boat, cook supper, and let the water move gently under the hull. That was the life magnetic attraction was supposed to give them. Not luxury in the loud sense. Something better. Freedom. Roger and Margaret had known each other since they were 17. They married in 1976, and by the time they reached the Caribbean, they had already shared decades of life together. Margaret later said she had real confidence in Roger, because they had done a lot of sailing together and a lot of miles. That confidence matters. Because at sea, confidence is everything. You have to trust the boat. You have to trust your own judgment. And if you are sailing as a couple, you have to trust each other in ways most people never have to think about. Roger and Margaret had that. They had the history, the experience, and the shared dream. There was no reason to believe that dream was about to end. On January 17, 2014, they were moored offshore at View Fort, St. Lucia. They had supper on the boat. Margaret updated the blog. Roger emailed friends. Then they went to bed at around 10:30. The boat was in darkness. It was quiet. It was normal. It was exactly the kind of night they had crossed an ocean to enjoy. And then, above their heads, came a sound that did not belong there. To understand how Roger and Margaret's retirement dream turned into a murder case, you have to understand the place where it happened. St. Lucia is the kind of island that sells itself without trying very hard. Green hills, bright blue water, warm air, beaches, reefs, harbors, and the kind of views that make people believe they have finally reached somewhere safe. For tourists, it looks like paradise. For sailors, it is one more beautiful stop in the Caribbean chain, a place to rest after long passages, make repairs, meet other cruisers, and enjoy the reward that comes after weeks at sea. That is how Roger and Margaret arrived there. They had already done the difficult part. Their yacht, Magnetic Attraction, had crossed the Atlantic and brought them safely to Martinique after 23 days on open water. From there, they moved on to St. Lucia, where they celebrated Margaret's 60th birthday, dived on reefs, and met other sailors. So by the time they reached View Fort, they were not supposed to be entering danger. They were supposed to be entering the easy part. View Fort sits at the southern end of St. Lucia. It is not the image most people hold in their heads when they picture the island from a tourist brochure, but it is part of the same world of anchorages, local boats, small movements across the water, and people coming and going between shore and sea. For a sailor, being moored offshore can feel peaceful. You are close enough to land to see the lights, close enough for supplies, close enough to call for help if something goes wrong. But you are still on your own boat. You still have that feeling of being separate from everything else. The cabin is yours. The deck is yours. The rhythm of the boat is familiar. That separation is part of the freedom. But it is also part of the vulnerability. A house has doors, walls, neighbors, streets, cameras, and a whole land-based world around it. A yacht at anchor has darkness, water, distance, and whatever security its owners can create for themselves. If someone decides to approach quietly at night, the boundary between safety and danger can be crossed in seconds. That is exactly what happened to Magnetic Attraction. Roger and Margaret were moored offshore at View Fort on January 17, 2014. That night, they had supper on the boat. Margaret updated their blog. Roger emailed friends. Around 10:30, they went to bed, and the boat was in darkness. Above them, outside the cabin, masked strangers were making their way onto the yacht. They had rowed out in a stolen fishing boat. Their plan, as it would later be described, was robbery. They wanted money. Maybe they looked at a foreign yacht and assumed there would be cash on board. Maybe they thought an older couple would be easy targets. Maybe they believed they could get on, take what they wanted, and disappear back to shore before anyone could stop them. But violent crimes rarely stay as simple as the people committing them imagine. The moment Roger and Margaret heard movement above them, the situation changed. Roger climbed up and told the men to go away. Margaret remembered that after that, everything became blurry. There were 4 masked strangers on board, and the robbery quickly became a violent attack. Roger fought one of the men at the stern. Margaret was grabbed and beaten while the men shouted for money. That is the heart of the nightmare. Not just that strangers came onto the boat, but that they came into the one place Roger and Margaret had every reason to trust. Magnetic attraction was not just an object. It was the boat Roger had chosen carefully because he wanted strength and reliability. It was the boat that had carried them across the Atlantic. It was their home from home, a practical, dependable vessel that reflected the way they had planned their life. And now, in a few moments, it had become a trap. The region itself would later become part of the conversation around the case. St. Lucia depends heavily on the image of tropical paradise, and tourist murders are obviously damaging to that image. But behind the beaches and the tourism campaigns, Margaret's fight for justice would expose deeper problems. Violent crime, under-resourced courts, long trial delays, and a justice system struggling to keep up. The Justice for Roger campaign later argued that St. Lucia had serious issues with violent crime and court backlog. It also made clear that local people suffered the most from that violence, which is important. This was not just a story about foreign tourists being harmed in paradise. It was also a story about an island community dealing with its own violence, its own fear, and a justice system under pressure. That wider background matters because Roger's murder did not happen in a vacuum. 4 young men from the area were arrested quickly. At first, it may have seemed like the case would be straightforward. There was a surviving witness. There was forensic evidence that should have mattered. There was confession evidence. The men were brought to court within weeks. But the story would not end quickly. Instead, Roger's murder became the start of a long legal battle. Evidence would later be questioned. Court dates would be delayed. Margaret would spend years pushing for a trial that seemed like it should have happened much sooner. And that is what makes this case bigger than a robbery gone wrong. It begins as a nightmare on a yacht. But it becomes a story about paradise, vulnerability, violence, and the slow machinery of justice. Roger and Margaret crossed an ocean to reach the Caribbean. The ocean did not defeat them. The boat did not fail them. The danger came from shore, in the dark, while they were finally supposed to be safe. In this case, the timeline is not about a boat drifting for days with nobody knowing where it went. It is about how fast a normal night can turn into the worst night of someone's life. On January 17, 2014, Roger and Margaret Pratt were moored offshore at View Fort, St. Lucia. They were not in the middle of a crossing anymore. They were not battling weather. They were not lost. They had already made it across the Atlantic, already reached the Caribbean, already started living the peaceful chapter they had worked toward for years. That evening, everything still looked ordinary. They had supper on the boat. Margaret brought their sailing blog up to date. Roger emailed friends. Then, around 10:30 at night, they went to bed. The boat was in darkness. That is the last clean moment in the timeline. A quiet yacht. A couple asleep. The water around them calm enough to feel safe. Then came the noise. Margaret later remembered hearing something unexpected from the stern counter above their heads. It was the kind of sound that does not belong on your boat at night. Movement. Footsteps. People above them. She and Roger both got up, and Roger climbed up toward the deck. Margaret remembered him saying, "Go away, just go away." Those words tell you a lot. Roger probably did not think the situation had already become deadly. Maybe he thought he could scare them off. Maybe he thought they were thieves who would leave once confronted. Maybe he believed that because the boat was close to shore, because there were other vessels nearby, because this was a mooring and not open ocean, there was still control. But there was not. 4 masked strangers had boarded Magnetic Attraction. They had rowed out in a stolen fishing boat, apparently trying to rob the couple. Within moments, Roger was fighting one of them at the stern. Margaret came out and was grabbed, held, and beaten while the men shouted for money. That is where the dream breaks. Not slowly. Not with a warning. Just suddenly. A retirement yacht becomes a trap. A peaceful Anchorage becomes an ambush. The deck Roger and Margaret trusted becomes a place of panic, confusion, and violence. Margaret fought back. She remembered one attacker wearing a mask, and she pulled it off. She was punching and kicking, and later pointed out that there should have been forensic evidence because of that contact. She even damaged her knuckle while fighting him. The attack seems to have been chaotic, not controlled. At some point, the men panicked. Margaret remembered someone saying something in patois. Then the attackers dropped everything, jumped into the water, and swam back toward shore. And then came the silence after the attack. Margaret was still on the boat. The men were gone. But Roger was not there. She called for him. No answer. That moment is the real disappearance in this case. It did not last days. It may have lasted only minutes. But for Margaret, standing on that boat in the dark, calling for the man she had crossed an ocean with, it must have felt endless. She dropped the dinghy into the water in case Roger was swimming nearby. Then she got on the VHF radio and called Mayday. Other vessels and local authorities raced to help. The response came. But the timeline had already moved too far. Over the radio, Margaret heard the words that confirmed the worst. A male had been found floating face down. Within minutes, Roger and Margaret were taken to an ambulance on the quay. Margaret later remembered holding Roger's hand. It was cold. By the time they reached the hospital, a doctor examined him and said he was deceased. Later, the court summary would make the sequence even clearer. Roger had been murdered aboard Magnetic Attraction, thrown unconscious into the sea, and drowned after suffering extensive brain damage in the attack. The entire timeline is brutally short. Supper. Blog update. Email. Bed. A noise from the stern. Masked men on deck. Roger fighting. Margaret attacked. The men fleeing into the water. A mayday call. Roger found face down. That is why this case is so disturbing. Roger and Margaret had survived 23 days crossing the Atlantic, but the fatal danger came after the crossing was over, while their yacht was moored in what should have been a safe Caribbean anchorage. The discovery in this case was not a missing yacht drifting somewhere far out at sea. It was worse in a different way. Magnetic attraction was still there. The boat had not vanished. It had not been swallowed by weather, dragged away by current, or found days later with no explanation. It was still moored off View Fort, still floating in the same dark Caribbean water where Roger and Margaret had gone to sleep only a short time earlier. But after the attackers jumped overboard and disappeared toward shore, Margaret realized the boat had changed. It was no longer just their home. It was the place where something terrible had happened. The men were gone, but Roger was not there. Margaret called for him, and for a moment, the entire nightmare became one simple question. Where was Roger? She dropped the dinghy into the water in case he was swimming nearby. That detail is heartbreaking, because it shows that even after the attack, there was still a small space for hope. Maybe he had fallen in. Maybe he was conscious. Maybe he was close enough to grab the dinghy. Maybe the night could still end with both of them alive, injured, shaken, but alive. Then Margaret called Mayday on the VHF radio. That call pulled other people into the darkness. Several vessels and local authorities raced to help, turning the water around Magnetic Attraction into a search scene. The quiet Anchorage, which only minutes earlier had held a sleeping couple and a dark boat, was suddenly full of urgency. Radios. Movement. People trying to understand what had happened and where Roger had gone. But the search did not last long before the answer came back. Over the radio, Margaret heard that a male had been found floating, face down. That was the moment the robbery became something much darker. Roger had not escaped the violence. He had not made it safely into the water. Later, the case summary would state that he had been murdered aboard Magnetic Attraction, thrown unconscious into the sea, and drowned. He had suffered extensive brain damage in the violent attack. It is hard to imagine the shock of that discovery. Only weeks earlier, Roger had helped bring that same boat across the Atlantic. 23 days on open water. Long watches. Careful planning. A steel hull chosen for strength. A voyage that had ended with Martinique rising on the horizon and champagne saved for the moment they dropped anchor. Now he was found in the water beside the dream he had spent years building. Margaret and Roger were taken to an ambulance on the quay. In her witness statement, Margaret remembered holding Roger's hand. It was cold. His lower limbs were beginning to turn a deep shade of purple. When they reached the hospital, a doctor examined him and said what nobody wanted to hear. Roger was deceased. That image becomes the emotional center of the whole case. Margaret was alive, but the life she had known had ended in front of her. She had survived the attack. She had fought back. She had pulled off one attacker's mask, punched and kicked, and damaged her own knuckle in the struggle. She believed there was definitely forensic evidence because of that contact. But surviving did not mean escaping. Because after the ambulance, after the hospital, after the confirmation, there was still the boat. Magnetic attraction had to be looked at differently now. The deck was not just a deck. The stern was not just the place where Roger had stood on watch or handled lines. The cabin was not just where they had gone to sleep after supper. The whole vessel had become a crime scene, holding the remains of a night that had started normally and ended with a body in the water. For investigators, the scene carried obvious questions. How did the men approach? What did they touch? What did they leave behind? What happened during the struggle? At what exact moment did Roger go overboard? And why did a robbery that may have been meant to be quick turn so violent? The attackers had panicked and fled, dropping everything before jumping into the water and swimming away. That panic may have left evidence behind. But it also left Margaret with the kind of silence that no investigation can fully repair. In the days and years that followed, magnetic attraction would no longer represent the future Roger and Margaret had planned. The boat was later shipped back to the UK and sold at a reduced price, described as forlorn-looking after the nightmare that had taken place in St. Lucia. And that is what makes the discovery so cruel. The boat survived. Margaret survived. But Roger did not. The yacht that had carried them to paradise became the place where paradise stopped being paradise. At first, the investigation looked like it might move quickly. And in a case like this, that made sense. There was a surviving witness. Margaret had seen the men. She had fought back. She had pulled off one attacker's mask. There had been direct physical contact, and in her mind, that meant there should have been forensic evidence left behind. The attackers had not disappeared into the open ocean. They had panicked, jumped into the water, and swum back toward shore. They had come from land, and they had returned to land. That gave police a much clearer direction than many crimes at sea ever have. And the authorities did move fast at the beginning. St. Lucia police came under immediate pressure. This was not just another robbery. A British tourist had been killed on his yacht, in a country whose economy depended heavily on the image of a tropical paradise. Tourist murders are the kind of cases no island wants attached to its name. By February 25, 2014, 4 young local men had been brought to court and charged. According to the case details, they had confessed to robbery and murder. From the outside, it may have looked straightforward. 4 suspects. A survivor. A violent attack. Forensic evidence. Confession evidence. A dead man pulled from the water. It looked like the kind of case that should have gone to trial quickly. But that is not what happened. After the early attention, the case began to slow down. Margaret had meetings with the Prime Minister, police, and tourism officials. For a while, it seemed like the authorities understood how serious the case was. Then came months of silence. And those months turned into years. Margaret said she was not being told why hearings were delayed. She had an attorney she paid to keep an eye on things, but even then, she struggled to get answers. The case that had once looked urgent began to feel stuck inside a system that could not move fast enough. And then the delays became more dangerous. Because over time, Margaret began hearing that the forensic evidence from the scene had been contaminated. Bags of items that reportedly carried DNA evidence had been compromised. At the same time, the defense began challenging the validity of the men's confessions. That changed the whole feeling of the case. What once looked clear was now becoming complicated. Margaret had believed the process should have been simple. There was strong forensic evidence. There was confession evidence. There seemed to be no good reason for the trial to be delayed again and again. But instead, she found herself watching the case weaken with time. And that became the second nightmare. The first nightmare had happened on the yacht. The second happened in the courts. Margaret was not only waiting for justice for Roger. She was also watching a system struggle to deliver justice for anyone involved. She even said she did not feel poisonous toward the accused men. She wanted a timely prosecution that properly tested the evidence in court, so the facts could finally be addressed. That is what makes her role in this case so unusual. She was the widow. She was the survivor. But she was also asking for fairness, clarity, and a process that worked. The trial finally came more than 6 years after Roger's death. On February 21, 2020, 3 men from View Fort were convicted of murdering Roger Pratt, and a fourth was found guilty of manslaughter. Then, in April 2021, the sentences were handed down. Richie Kern, who admitted hitting Roger, received around 14 3/4 years. Jermoyne Jones received around 22 years. Kervin Dervaux received around 19 3/4 years. Fannis Joseph, convicted of manslaughter, received around 6.5 years. Margaret attended the sentencing by Zoom and said she was relieved that, after more than 7 years, there was finally some clarity about how long Roger's killers would serve. But by then, justice had already taken a long time to arrive. And time was something Roger and Margaret's dream no longer had. For Margaret Pratt, the attack did not end when the men jumped into the water. That was only the first part of the nightmare. The second part began after Roger was gone, after magnetic attraction was no longer a home, and after the future they had built together suddenly had to be packed away, sold, and remembered instead of lived. The yacht that had carried them across the Atlantic was eventually shipped back to the UK and sold. The source describes it as forlorn-looking, being returned for sale at a reduced price only weeks after it had represented the beginning of Roger and Margaret's retirement dream. That is a hard thing to imagine. A boat like that is not just fiberglass, steel, rope, and sails. For Roger and Margaret, it had been years of planning. It had been weekends on the water. It had been their crossing, their champagne moment in Martinique, their Caribbean arrival, their shared plan for the years ahead. And then it became something Margaret could not continue with. Roger and Margaret had known each other since they were 17. They had married in 1976, and by the time they reached St. Lucia, they had already lived a lifetime together. Margaret later said she had real confidence in Roger, because they had sailed many miles together. After his death, she said the hardest moments came when she had to do something Roger would normally have done as a matter of course. Those were the moments where she felt the reality of being on her own. That is the quiet aftermath people do not always see. The headlines focus on the attack. The court focuses on the evidence. But grief lives in the ordinary things. A job he would have handled. A decision he would have helped make. A boat task that used to belong to him. A silence where his voice should be. 4 years, Margaret also lived with uncertainty from the legal process. She said she needed certainty in order to plan, and she wanted closure. But the case kept dragging on, and until it was finished, she felt unable to move forward with the work she wanted to do. What makes Margaret's response stand out is that she did not turn the case into simple hatred. She wanted justice for Roger, but she also wanted the process to be fair. She said she did not feel poisonous toward the accused men. She believed they needed their day in court too. What she wanted was a timely prosecution, proper testing of the evidence, an apology, and a better understanding of what had gone wrong with the forensics. That made the case bigger than one murder. It became a story about a woman trying to force a slow system to give answers, not only for her, but for everyone touched by the case. Finally, in February 2020, after more than 6 years of waiting, 3 men were convicted of murdering Roger and a fourth was convicted of manslaughter. Margaret said she was relieved that justice had finally been done, even though nothing could bring Roger back. In April 2021, the men were sentenced. Margaret attended by Zoom and said that, after more than 7 years, there was finally clarity about how long Roger's killers would serve. But clarity is not restoration. The court could sentence the men. The campaign could reach its conclusion. The yacht could be sold. But the life Roger and Margaret had sailed toward together was gone. And Margaret's next journey would be one she had to begin without him. In the end, magnetic attraction did exactly what Roger Pratt built her to do. She crossed the Atlantic. She carried Roger and Margaret through 23 days of open water, through long nights, ration supplies, and the kind of distance that tests both a boat and the people inside it. And when Martinique finally rose on the horizon, it should have meant the dangerous part was over. They had made it. They had reached the Caribbean. They had opened the champagne. And for a few weeks, the dream looked real. But the ocean was never the thing that took Roger from Margaret. The boat did not fail. The weather did not turn. The Atlantic did not beat them. The danger came later, from the shore, in the dark, while they were moored in what should have been a quiet Anchorage. That is what makes this case so unsettling. Roger and Margaret had spent years building toward a peaceful retirement on the water. A life of sailing, warm islands, companionship, and freedom. But off View Fort, St. Lucia, that dream was interrupted by four masked men in a stolen fishing boat. Within minutes, their floating home became a place of violence. Roger was thrown unconscious into the sea, where he drowned. Margaret survived. But survival came with years of waiting. Years of court delays. Years of questions about contaminated evidence, disputed confessions, and a justice system that moved far slower than grief ever does. Eventually, the men responsible were convicted and sentenced. But by then, magnetic attraction had already been shipped home and sold. The voyage Roger and Margaret planned together was over. A yacht built for freedom became a crime scene. A Caribbean dream became a warning. And off the coast of St. Lucia, paradise stopped being paradise.